Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. President Obama has picked up endorsements from the Denver Post, the Tampa Bay Times, and the Salt Lake City Tribune. And a federal judge blocked Arizona yesterday from applying a new law that bars Planned Parenthood clinics from receiving state funding. We'll be talking more about how women's issues have played in the presidential campaign in just a minute. Right now, my great pleasure to introduce Patrick Gaspard, Executive Director of the Democratic National Committee, Rebecca Traister, friend of the program, author of Big Girls Don't Cry, The Election That Changed Everything for American Women, and a contributor to Salon.com, Father Bill Daly, a Roman Catholic priest who's a lecturer in law at the University of Notre Dame Law School and a fellow at the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture, and an indefatigable email correspondent, and MSNBC contributor Victoria De Francesco Soto, also contributor to NBC Latino, and an fellow at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin. You guys are an august panel. That was a lot to get through. All right. If this week has told us anything about the presidential election, it's that women appear to be the most sought-after portion of the electorate. The morning after President Obama stepped off stage in New York from the second debate with Mr. Romney, where he trumpeted his signing of the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, he was in Iowa telling a crowd that women should get equal pay for equal work. Governor Romney, on the other hand, was in Virginia telling a crowd that the president has failed American women, and we're going to talk about his binder issue in just a bit. But even though it's not really being talked about on the stump, abortion is still a top issue in these swing states. According to a recent Gallup poll, women in 12 swing states cited abortion as their most important issue, followed by jobs. The Romney campaign used an ad this week to try to clarify the candidate's current position on the issue.
You know, those ads saying Mitt Romney would ban all abortions and contraception seemed a bit extreme. So I looked into it. Turns out Romney doesn't oppose contraception at all. In fact, he thinks abortion should be an option in cases of rape, incest, or to save a mother's life. This issue is important to me, but I'm more concerned about the debt our children will be left with. I voted for President Obama last time, but we just can't afford 4 more years.
It didn't take long for the Obama campaign to respond with an ad of its own.
Seen this from Mitt Romney? Then take a look at this.
If Roe v. Wade was overturned, Congress passed a federal ban on all abortions and it came to your desk, would you sign it? Yes or no?
Let me say it. I'd be delighted to sign that bill.
Banning all abortions?
I'd be delighted to sign that bill.
Trying to mislead us? That's wrong. But ban all abortions? Only if you vote for him.
In fairness, the Obama ad doesn't give the full context of the Romney quote. It cuts out the part before and after Romney's remark where he talks about the issue of abortion being returned to the states in this hypothetical post-Roe world, and the part immediately after where he seems to imply that the lack of national consensus on the issue means that such hypothetical legislation simply would not happen. Remarkably, though, with all the talk on the airwaves now about abortion, you should know there was not one mention of the word during Tuesday's debate. Contraception, on the other hand, made more than a cameo.
In my health care bill, I said insurance companies need to provide contraceptive coverage to everybody who's insured, because this is not just a health issue, it's an economic issue for women. Governor Romney not only opposed it, he suggested that, in fact, employers should be able to make the decision as to whether or not a woman gets contraception through her insurance coverage. That's not the kind of advocacy that women need.
I don't believe that bureaucrats in Washington should tell someone whether they can use contraceptives or not. And I don't believe employers should tell someone whether they could have contraceptive care or not. Every woman in America should have access to contraceptives. And the president's statement of my policy is completely and totally wrong.
At the end of that exchange, President Obama can be overheard saying, "Governor, that's not true." And the reason he said that is because despite Romney's attempt to soften his message on birth control, he supported the Blunt Amendment back in February, which would allow employers to deny contraceptive coverage to their female employees for religious or moral reasons. The confusion over Romney's position on contraception is understandable. First, he said he was against the Blunt Amendment, then he said he was actually for it, and now he seems to have given the impression he has reversed his position again. First, before we talk about the Blunt Amendment, and I know Notre Dame is a party to the lawsuit against the federal government for the issuing of the Affordable Care Act regulation that requires insurance coverage. Before we talk about the specifics of that, before we even talk about abortion, I would like you guys to tell me how you feel about the way in which women's issues are being discussed. Because it seems to me that it's a fine line between speaking to a certain constituency and pandering to a certain constituency and condescending to a certain constituency. And it often seems that we're blurring those lines during this conversation. Rebecca.
Well, this happens. I should say it happens every 4 years like clockwork. There is a sudden, incredible, burning interest in women's issues amongst men in Washington who spend the rest of the 3 3/4 of a year not caring at all. Now, I prefer the pandering to the completely ignoring women's issues. So I will take it. And the other thing I will say is that I'm not reflexively always happy with how President Obama talks about women's issues. I've been critical of some of the things he said in the past. I actually thought the way he addressed the equal pay issue during this debate was one of the best, most thoughtful and comprehensive answers I have seen out of any politician, because what he did, answering a question about equal pay, he hit Lilly Ledbetter, which is the obvious response. He signed this legislation that dealt directly with equal pay. But then he went into bigger systemic things, like talking about Pell Grants and the role of education in women getting toward equal pay, and then bringing it to contraception and talking about the ability to control reproductive health. This was a terrific, thoughtful, systemic answer in which he said my dream sentence, which is this is not just women's issues and these are not just family issues, these are economic issues. That's one of the smartest ways I've heard it addressed. So it may be pandering, but it brought us a terrific answer that I think helped.
But I think the rights of women are not addressed directly, and I think we saw this very clearly in the vice presidential debate, where the candidates were asked about their beliefs about abortion, but not necessarily about theoretically, what do you believe the rights of women should be, in particular with terminating a pregnancy or not. So I think that we're seeing the interests of women being, as my political theory friend Elisa Kessel would say, subverted. First to men, in terms of being in charge in most of the state legislatures, to medical professionals in many instances. And second, if you read the RNC platform and the plank on abortion, to fetuses. There's a lot of discussion about fetuses and their rights, but there's no discussion about women only in terms of how they relate to, their bodies would relate to medical practices.
Well, Patrick.
Well, I was just going to jump in on Rebecca's point. Generally, I agree with Rebecca, but the notion that for both candidates on stage that night, that women's issues were being thrown out there for the first time because they happen to be running is not exactly true in the instance of the president, since we all know that the very first bill that he signed into law was Lilly Ledbetter. Clearly, his appointments to the Supreme Court would suggest that he is concerned about women's empowerment and women having the ability to make decisions for themselves about the society. And clearly, given all that took place during the litigation of Obamacare, the president always lifted up
particularly the birth control regulation that was issued. What you just said is interesting to me because it's the way that Democrats talk about abortion. What you just said about the Supreme Court. Were you talking about abortion just then when you said...
No, actually, I was not.
Okay.
I was actually talking about the people that he's actually named to the Supreme Court, and he's doubled the number of women who are on that court, and I would suspect that given their experiences, that they might have a contribution to make when issues that are principally affecting the healthcare lives of women come before the court.
What's fascinating to me, Father, is that you have a situation right now in which, and you're both a Roman Catholic priest and a lawyer, in which the Supreme Court, there's essentially 5 votes to uphold Roe. One of those votes is Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
There may be more than 5. But
there may be. We know 5, right? We can count 5, exactly. Yeah, you're right. That's a very good point. And yet, that aspect of it seems incredibly distant in the national debate, and it seemed almost weirdly taboo to talk about. There was a moment where Vice President Biden in the vice presidential debate basically said, essentially, we're going to nominate pro-choice justices, and they won't. And Paul Ryan shot back, are you asking, is that a litmus test? And I am in the position that we should just know. I mean, we know where both parties are in this issue. There shouldn't be this bizarre taboo around saying about what
we
the
have a tradition, right, where any judicial nominee, as to any future issue, will refuse to predict their vote, even if we think it's probably relatively predictable, at least in some cases.
Is that a good tradition, though, in this case?
There's a sort of, that's a big, what are the separation of powers issue? What is the Senate permitted to know and have as a litmus test? I think you can argue that either way, irrespective of the merits or demerits of a particular issue like Roe versus Wade. So that's a more complicated jurisprudence issue. I do think there's a political minor point here. Why wouldn't the candidates spontaneously mention abortion when we know that to their base they're starting to do it a little bit more, which is an interesting phenomenon, that the Obama campaign is being more explicit about it. when typically you wouldn't, shows that there's some base politics going on, which is kind of late in the game for that. Maybe they're more worried about Ohio than we thought. But I want to problematize the whole idea of women's issues here. I don't speak for all women, but neither do the two women here.
Right.
There are lots of women's health issues. The idea that contraception, which misleadingly was never in the president's bill, right? Congress has tried many times to pass a contraception mandate. It always failed. ACA had a vague mandate about preventive services, and the Department of Health and Human Services decided to interpret that as they chose to. There are so many things that we don't provide women for free that might be more useful, like the cost of insulin for women whose children have diabetes. That's a woman's issue. It's also a men's issue. The stability and strength of marriages is a women's issue. But when we talk about the narrow slate of women's issues within politics, this is one where it seems to be the Democratic Party and its narrow slate of issues. I'm not saying they're not important issues, but it's hardly obvious that they are the only women's issues or the most important women's
why
issues.
be mutually exclusive then?
Rebecca, you seem to want.
I think Rebecca was making a broader point, actually, about how all this fits in a broader economic frame. But I don't want to.
Yes, and that in fact it is a daily issue for women. Right. And you're right that there are millions of women out there who have all different kinds of feelings about this, and women who do not believe, for example, in using contraception are more than free to not avail themselves of contraception. The management of this particular health issue for women, I think sometimes perhaps men don't understand. It is a daily, regular thing that women think about all the time throughout their lives, often regardless of circumstances. I mean, often, if they're not having sex, if they don't have active sex lives, they need to avail themselves of contraception. So it is the degree to which the issue of controlling reproduction is something that affects all women out there is something that I don't think that can be overstated enough. It is a daily issue affecting women and their bodies.
You're arguing that there's a substantive centrality to the issue greater than essentially a kind of political carving of that space because of this bill.
And I agree that there are all kinds of other things that women should be and can and ought to be getting through my beliefs for free. I think we should get
this
lots
is just
of
the start,
free.
America.
It's just the beginning.
And I want to make a point. I want to make a point about the politics, particularly around abortion and choice. That's important in this respect. Right after this break.
Accept the Supreme Court decision finding a right to privacy in the Constitution.
I don't believe they decided that correctly. In my view, Roe v. Wade was improperly decided. It was based upon that same principle. And in my view, if we had justices like Roberts, Alito, Thomas, and Scalia, and more justices like that, they might well decide to return this issue to states as opposed to saying it's in the federal Constitution. Do I believe Supreme Court should overturn Roe v. Wade? Yes, I do.
That's Mitt Romney speaking about his judicial vision for the Supreme Court in January. Just one point I want to make, piggybacking off what you said, Father, is that, I want to make sure in the liberal bubble sometimes we can conflate women's issues and women's preferences with pro-choice, right? And it's important to say that there are millions and millions and millions of women who are very vehemently opposed to abortion, sometimes in all cases. And the polling on this, there is a gender gap in the polling on this, but it's also the case that there are literally tens of millions of women who have that belief. So I just want to fall into the trap, I think liberals sometimes do, in which we say women and obviously choice and women and choice go together, and that is not always the case.
It's also true that fetuses are not gender neutral. More than half of them, it turns out, are little girls. And so if one is thinking about abortion and women's issue, it's not uncomplicated.
No, absolutely. But in terms of
depersonalizing the fetus doesn't.
But the fetus vis-a-vis the woman. I think in the focus being and the platform being on the fetus rather than on the woman, why not talk about both if that is of concern? So I think that was the question that I had.
Patrick, this issue on the Blunt Amendment, what's fascinating about it, it's fascinating to me that it's now here centerpiece in this debate because it actually did begin. It was a little seed planted in a bureaucratic bed of soil, right? It was a provision in the Affordable Care Act really about cost and cost containment and the wisdom of comprehensive preventative care coverage as a mechanism for reducing long-run healthcare costs because it's better to give people free checkups, right? Because you don't want to incentivize people not to go to free checkups or get preventative care. It'll be more expensive later on.
It's all the free things that Rebecca was just...
That's right. That's right. And so, but it has now become a real political issue, and I wonder where you think... Do you think think you have the political upper hand, for lack of a better word, on this issue, on the contraception ruling?
It's an issue that has become part of the conversation in this campaign, but it's not a political issue for us. But if you don't mind, Chris, please. I really want to go back to the video that you just showed a second ago as the lead into this conversation. It was one of the very few moments in the course of the last year or so where there's been absolutely no obfuscation from Mitt Romney when he answered the question of whether or not he believes that Roe versus Wade should be repealed. He was 100% clear, said absolutely should be. So despite what he's now saying on stage about his judicial appointments, despite what he's saying about where he stands on the broader issue of choice in the instance of rape and incest, he was incredibly clear in that one moment. And I think that it's our responsibility to hold him accountable to.
Well, I'm taking the contrarian view on litmus tests, which is, if you, viewer at home, believe that Roe should be upheld, you should vote one way. If you believe Roe should be overturned, you should vote another way. Obviously, it's not the only issue, but just no one should be fooling themselves about where the two parties are institutionally, structurally, in terms of what the nominating processes are going to produce from these two parties. Everyone should just be very clear about what they're going to get. The other big moment in that the debate having to do with women's issues is the now infamous binders full of women. And here's Romney. I actually didn't think it was as laughable or ridiculous or kind of ridicule-worthy as it has developed into. But here is the moment when he's asked about equal pay, and this was his response.
As I was serving as governor of my state, because I had the chance to pull together a cabinet, and all the applicants seemed to be men. And I went to my staff and I said, how come all the people for these jobs are all men? So we took a concerted effort to go out and find women who had backgrounds that could be qualified to become members of our cabinet. I went to a number of women's groups and said, can you help us find folks? And they brought us whole binders full of women.
That's the binders full of women. So I want to bring in now Lauren Rickleen, who is co-chair of MassGap, which is the bipartisan coalition of women's groups working to increase the number of women in Massachusetts state government. She was part of the task force that collected the resumes, vetted potential candidates for cabinet positions while Mr. Romney was running for Massachusetts governor in 2002, and actually put together the now infamous binder full of women.
Binders full of women.
Yes. I was going to ask you a snarky question about what brand. Did you go the Trapper Keeper? Did you find that you had to reinforce the resumes? But in all seriousness, will you tell me a little bit about the context for this? Because for some reason it sort of captured people's imagination. I actually thought it was a really pretty good argument in favor of what we generally call affirmative action, which is making an affirmative effort to make sure that you are recruiting and finding qualified people from outside the small, narrow world of white men. What was the actual circumstances that produced these binders?
Well, in 2002, while the race was going on between then candidate Romney and candidate Shannon O'Brien, a coalition of women's organizations led by what's called MassGap, the Massachusetts Government Appointments Process Project, sought to got together and said, we have to change the paradigm here in terms of the number of women in state government in leadership roles. And we created a pledge. We went to both candidates and said, if we work together and if we go out and find, as a group of very dedicated women, if we go out and recruit high-level women and then interview, vet, and provide you the product of that effort, will you commit to work with us and make your cabinet reflective of the number of women in Massachusetts, which was around 52% at that time. So it was what we were doing was an effort to make a process by which both candidates would agree to increase the number of women in the cabinet. I'll make a commitment to close to half.
So I want to get your response to what you thought when this came up in debate, and then the reaction to it, and I want to hear also how this worked. I mean, was this a successful effort? And have the panel weigh in right after this. All right, we're talking about the binders full of women issue, and I want to ask you what was your reaction when it came up in the debate, and was Mitt Romney misleading insofar as he made it sound like this was an affirmative choice that he made?
Well, I mean, I think for those of us who were involved in the process, when it came up in the debate and we heard it, of course we all had a very similar reaction, which is we were there so we understand how it came about. There's no question that it came about as an affirmative process created by MASCAP prior to the actual election of the governor. At the same time, one of the things that we all care about is that when we have these kinds of discussions, we also focus on why is it we are at this point in time, whether it's 2002 or 2012, where we still have to create massive processes to get women into higher appointed position. And if we don't pay attention and keep counting the metrics, those metrics drop. I think the larger conversation is a conversation that we need to have, and we're not having.
Yeah, it's a great point. Patrick, I want you to it has become this kind of point of ridicule on the campaign trail. It's a punchline now in the president's stump speech. And why the big deal about this? Why is it President?
The process as described by Lauren should not be ridiculed, and it's to the governor's credit that his lieutenant governor was assigned to take this very seriously and to work with MASCAP to make sure that women were represented in government. However, that response was ridiculed because it was in response to a question about the pay equity law, which Mitt Romney refuses to take a position on, which his vice presidential nominee voted against. If you go back to that tape for a second, think about it for a second. Mitt Romney becomes governor. It's 2002. He's not a 20-year-old man. He's been in private business in that state for 25 years, and yet someone has to come to him with binders full of women in order for him to be able to identify women who should be in leadership.
It was insulting, binders full of women, and also he kind of botched the story. But he brings up the larger issue of descriptive representation.
Yes.
And Chris, you brought this up earlier, in that women, if we look just at elected offices, less than a quarter of all our elected bodies are made up of women. And then this gets into the issue of talking about making decisions for women's health care, economic welfare. So I think he did bring up an important position, and this is something that we need to look at in addition to issues such as contraception and the Lilly Ledbetter Act.
Important point.
But again, it's a very complicated issue. It is a question of why do we have trouble in this day and age? But it probably isn't just because no one wants to have women around, or men who are in control still don't want to have women around. During the break, you were saying that you were upset that this came up in the context of his talking about people needing to make dinner at 5 o'clock. The reality is, and we see this in the legal profession a lot, women are now graduating at majority rates from top law schools. A few years ago, a bunch of women law deans from top law schools got together. Is it not true? Okay, but it's close. I mean, we're basically
the number of women in law
schools.
The number of women in law schools has been declining since 2002. It's becoming a crisis in terms of that issue. And you and I are in the same profession, so that the numbers are dropping. And when we talk about pay equity, why? And I think the biggest problem is that the specific question wasn't answered. But in 2010, Congress had an opportunity to vote on pay equity, and that vote was kept from floor discussion. And yet, why is it not front and center today for everybody who's running to office to say, would you support a law to create economic parity for men and women? And how is it that that becomes a women's issue as opposed to an economic issue at a time when the majority of households are dual income earners?
Let me make one little clarifying point here, because I think there is a little misimpression about what the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act did. It did not in any way actually mandate pay equity. What it did was it revised. I know you know that. I just want to make sure viewers know that, because I think there's a little confusion about what actually the substance of it is. It revised a statutory provision that had been the subject of a Supreme Court ruling in which Lilly Ledbetter, who was the plaintiff in that case, only discovered the equity problem years and years and years after it had begun, and the court essentially ruled that she couldn't sue because she had missed the window of raising the issue. And so what the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act says, it essentially keeps that window open. It says as soon as you find out this has been going on, it's not a question of when you started getting screwed. It's as soon as you find out that you're getting screwed on pay, then you can raise it. So I just want people to be clear.
And you can raise it. There's no guaranteed result.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. So it's not like there is no law in America mandating pay equity, although that might be.
But that's right. And that's what in 2010 the Paycheck Fairness Act was all about. That would have been the follow-up to Lilly Ledbetter that would have created pay equity.
You know, and it's interesting that Romney has drawn apart from this because he is saying that Obama has waged an economic war on women. So this would actually fit in well with his argument that women should support him for economic reasons.
Right, but the pay equity stuff gets, I mean, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce doesn't want the Paycheck Fairness Act. I want to talk more about paycheck fairness right after this quick break. Talk about the role that women's issues played in the debate and has played in the campaign. And Father Bill, you had made a point about the roots of this pay equity gap, which exists, and some of it being there being a complicated bundle of causes, possibly one of them being the management of what we call work-life balance, and that was part of actually. The other part of the Binder's response was Mitt Romney said, and the other thing that the reason that I'm sort of plugged into the issue and recognized was that we had women who were working for us. We realized we had to be flexible so that she could get home and make dinner. Let me just quickly give the statistic to close the loop on this conversation. And Rebecca, I know you want something you want to say on this, but 42% of Mr. Romney's senior level appointments were women during his first 2 years in office, and that dropped off to 25% in his final 2 years, which I think, Lauren, goes to your point about sort of maintaining vigilance in the face of this. Rebecca, on this flex time question, what was your response to that part of the?
That was the part, more than the Binders, that was the part of his answer that seemed to me reflective of some of Romney's attitudes about gender in the workforce. What he said was, when you have women in the workforce, we understand they have sort of special needs. They have to leave at 5 to go cook dinner for their kids. He actually specifically called out, I believe, his chief of staff, and he said, for example, my chief of staff had 2 young children at home. Now, would he have said that if his chief of staff had been a man who had 2 young children at home? What he was doing was treating the women who he was working with. What that comment said was that if you were a female and working, then your responsibilities to your young children clearly will make you a sort of special case within the workforce. This is the root of at least part of pay inequity in this country, is the idea that if you are a woman, you have to specially divide your time, but that if you are a man, you just work and you don't need to go home and cook dinner for your family. This situates him about 5 decades ago, when men, when women were responsible for putting a hot meal on the table at 5, or
which is early. I like to eat it a little later.
So it sort of positions him several decades ago, and B is precisely the problem that he failed to address in his answer about pay equity.
Well, but let me come to the defense of Mitt Romney a little bit here.
I was going to defend Romney.
Oh, you defend.
I understand that the fact that this is a special case, I get that. But the fact that he brought it up, because we can't address the issue of women trying to multitask unless we bring it up. And he brought it to the forefront.
Well, he actually brought it up as a way of avoiding the question about
I don't deny
he was trying to get a badge of honor for allowing his chief of staff to go home early to cook.
About it right now, I mean, the fact that it has come up, and we're not just talking about abortion or contraception, but we're also talking about time management and how women can juggle all of these things.
But you suggest that is women's unique responsibility.
Lauren, please.
Thank you. I think the problem is that when we personalize his chief of staff or this individual, we take away from the larger point. And one of the critical larger points here is that we are facing a new generation coming into the workplace in which the issues of raising children actively, being part of who cooks dinner and who cleans the house, is a gender-neutral issue. And we have a workplace that is completely ill-equipped to be able to address that very changing demographic.
And that's a conversation.
So that's another whole issue we have to talk about.
I think that's a conversation that I was trying to make a rare feminist point for Catholic priests to make. Feminism could enrich this conversation by not describing it, I'm sorry, but you can't reduce it to the Fair Pay Act, right? If we always go back to this political event that happened, that's a pretty narrow point about statutes of limitations, and you can argue it either way.
There was a very pointed question that was put to the candidate.
I understand, but the issue is a much richer issue than that, and whether Mitt Romney's way of talking about it, I mean, we do politics by anecdote now. His raising of his chief of staff was perhaps time-bound by his age, but...
The anecdotal feint, though, has also become a real trope, particularly for Paul Ryan and Mitt Romney in this, when there's a policy on the table that they feel... I mean, on Afghanistan, Paul Ryan was asked about Afghanistan, and he said, there's someone that I grew up with who has served there, which is good, and it's good that he has that relationship. But the question is, are you going to get out of Afghanistan in 2014? There is actually a policy issue on the table, Rebecca.
And I would also say that feminists do make it a richer issue. I mean, this particular question was pointed, but in fact, the very thing I was praising Barack Obama for earlier, which is pointing out that pay equity also has to do with college, it has to do with contraception, it has to do with health care. That is...
And they all tie in together.
That they all tie in together.
How you can control how many children you have is also going to affect how you work.
Part of the reason I love doing the show on the weekends is is that the way the schedule works out is that I have a lot of time with my daughter during the part of the week. And so I have an extremely non-traditional work schedule right now, which in some ways is weird and bad, but in other ways it means that Ryan and I get to chill. All right, Lauren Rickleen, co-chair of MassGap, thanks for joining us this morning. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And Rebecca Tracer from Salon.com. Great to have you as always.
Great to be here.
President Obama and Mitt Romney swear their undying faithfulness to coal. My story of the week is next. All right, my story of the week, the climate silence at the debates. 4 years ago, when Barack Obama and John McCain met for a town hall debate, they met as two men who each accepted the scientific consensus that fossil fuels are warming our planet. They met as two candidates with competing plans to deal with this challenge, though their plans differed on the details. And over the course of the evening, they were even asked a direct question about the issue.
I want to know what you would do within the first 2 years to make sure that Congress moves fast as far as environmental issues like climate change and green jobs.
We can move forward and clean up our climate and develop green technologies and alternative energies.
And we're not going to be able to deal with the climate crisis if our only solution is to use more fossil fuels that create global warming.
In the wake of this week's debate, that moment in 2008 seems like something excavated from the ruins of a destroyed civilization. Despite the fact that this past September was tied for the warmest in the 132-year history of record-keeping, the word climate crossed neither candidate's lips, nor was it mentioned by moderator Candy Crowley or the audience of undecided voters selected to ask questions. Crowley explained the omission of the issue this way.
You called through all of these questions that these undeclared voters brought in this morning. I know that this was such a big concern of yours. How did you decide which ones to choose?
We wanted to cover subjects that maybe folks hadn't heard about but still were interested in. I think
immigration,
gun control and immigration women's issues were the three big ones. Climate change. I had that question to all you climate change people. We just, again, we knew that the economy was still the main thing.
Climate change people is a revealing phrase. It suggests that climate is a boutique issue, like NIMBY opposition to an unsightly development down the block or advocating for the metric system. But I can't really blame Crowley for the omission, because the candidates both spent much of the night talking about the related and entirely inseparable issue of energy and had every opportunity to, at the very least, mention our single greatest governing challenge. Instead, the entire debate about energy, such as it was a debate over who can most ruthlessly facilitate the total and utter exploitation of every last ounce of fossilized carbon sitting beneath the continent.
We're actually drilling more on public lands than in the previous administration.
I will fight for oil, coal, and natural gas.
Go after natural gas.
More drilling, more permits and licenses.
Increased oil production.
Drilling offshore in Alaska, drilling offshore in Virginia.
We've built enough pipeline to wrap around the entire Earth.
In fact, one of the most unintentionally hilarious moments of the night, and this hasn't gotten a lot of attention, Mitt Romney was asked by a voter to reassure her that his presidency wouldn't just be a reprise of the disastrous tenure of George W. Bush. How are you different, she asked. First, Romney avoided the question by attempting to litigate President Obama's previous response. But then Mitt Romney gathered himself and began to list his differences with Bush. And remarkably, his number one difference with George W. Bush, the thing he started with, the very first difference he listed, was that unlike Bush, Mitt Romney, was really enthusiastic about fossil fuel extraction. That under George W. Bush, we hadn't succeeded in scraping every last cell of carbon from this withering husk of an Earth, but under Romney, we would sink a drill and mine into every last surface across this great land.
What is the biggest difference between you and George W. Bush, and how do you differentiate yourself from George W. Bush?
President Bush and I are different people, and these are different times. And that's why my 5-point plan is so different than what he would have done. I mean, for instance, we can now, by virtue of new technology, actually get all the energy we need in North America without having to go to the Arabs or the Venezuelans or anyone else. That wasn't true in his time. That's why my policy starts with a very robust policy to get all that energy in North America and become energy secure.
Imagine for a moment if discussion of the national debt and long-term deficits, both candidates had taken to competing to say who would have the biggest deficits, who would increase the rate of healthcare costs the fastest and push interest rates up the most. This was roughly what the energy debate was like. And yet, the politics of this aren't as logic-defying as the substance. Right now, it is looking more and more likely the outcome of this election will come down to Ohio, and more specifically, the voters in the southeastern portion of the state that is coal country. The people who work in that industry are understandably worried about their future and their livelihoods. Coal has had a bit of a rough stretch over the last 2 years as it makes up a shrinking portion of our domestic energy consumption. The inconvenient truth is that there is a war on coal, but it's not being waged by the Obama administration. No, the relentless assault on coal is coming from the natural gas industry. Thanks to its breakthrough in hydrofracking and extraction of shale gas, it can now produce energy that's both relatively cleaner and cheaper than coal. The folks whose livelihoods depend on the antique, planet-endangering technology of coal and the 1%ers who own the mines are understandably spooked. And so we have this asymmetry of passion. On one side of the ledger, a concentrated set of interests and voters who care in a near life-and-death way about the continued exploitation of dirty energy. And on the other side, a public with a weak, nonchalant preference for us to do something about that whole climate change thing. Barack Obama isn't going to rectify this imbalance. The only way to get a sane climate debate is in our national conversation is to create a cadre of activists and citizens and voters who will balance that ledger, who care as passionately about saving the planet from ruin as those on the other side do about their industry. Because they see and understand just as viscerally as the other side that, yes, this really is a life or death issue, not for one industry or one region of one state, but for the planet and every single person we love who lives on it. I want to talk to my panel about where Democrats are on this right after this. Joining me now at the table is Tyson Slocum, the director of the Public Citizen Energy Program, which focuses on climate change, coal, oil, fracking, nuclear, and other renewable energies. Tyson, what was your response to watching the debate and specifically the energy portion of the debate?
Well, I mean, it's really disappointing that the attitudes and opinions of a vast majority of Americans, a recent Yale poll showed that 70% of Americans understand that global warming is real, and more than half people understand that humans from burning fossil fuels is the cause. And those opinions are not being adequately reflected in this debate. What we have to understand is that while the science behind climate change is very compelling, the politics and the economics of energy policy is what's dominating things. We have to remember that in 2012, the United States is the largest fossil fuel producer on the planet. And that means that we've got huge corporations here in the United States making a killing extracting fossil fuels and benefiting from the status quo. So they have mobilized an unprecedented political operation, aided by Citizens United, so they saturate the airwaves and inform citizens on the fossil fuel version of energy reality that is completely distanced from what we need to do. Because while it is clear that there are a lot of people that are employed by the fossil fuel industry, there are more Americans that are harmed by the burning of fossil fuels, and fossil fuels are going to become increasingly expensive. We no longer can afford the status quo from a consumer standpoint or from a climate standpoint.
I'm not sure if I'm sold on the increasingly expensive, particularly as natural gas is concerned, because natural gas is what's happening with natural gas is remarkable. It's unlike anything I've ever seen in an energy market ever, or even in any other market aside from maybe like personal computers.
Until we have a BP Deepwater Horizon in someone's aquifer. Yes. And that's the issue is, can we trust these companies in a lightly regulated environment to do the right thing? I don't.
Two interesting little pieces of data that I think are important. And then, Patrick, I want you to talk about the president's record on this issue because he didn't talk about it explicitly. One is that we've seen a doubling in the portion of our electricity that comes from renewables in the 4 years Barack Obama has been president. I think it went from about 3 to 6%. Yeah. We're hitting the wind energy targets that were projected out to 2040 already. And also, and this is a kind of amazing paradox, right? As climate has lurched backwards in the political debate, emissions have come down quite a bit. We now have carbon emissions in 2012 at the 1990 levels. Yeah. Now, this is a result of two things. Massive economic contraction, which is that first dip there around 2008, and then the natural gas boom, and the way that natural gas has BTU for BTU replaced coal and emits much less. Patrick, is it an explicit political strategy to not talk about climate?
No, it absolutely is not. I actually want to point you back to the most important speech that the president's made during the entire election cycle, which is, of course, the convention speech that he delivered from Charlotte, North Carolina, where he explicitly talked about climate change and actually pushed back against Republicans who were ridiculing the science of climate change in their convention. And to go back to the clip that you showed, Chris, in all fairness to the president, that was just one little snippet, part of a larger answer where he actually talked about our need to make sure that
he talked about
renewables. He talked about wind. He talked about solar. He talked about biofuels. That was just one part of his response. But I actually want to go back to what Tyson was saying about the percentage of Americans who are concerned about this issue, and I want to go back to that stirring homily that the father was getting envious. The stirring homily that you opened the segment with. 70% of Americans do express some concern over this issue. But I would just suggest, as somebody who came up through organizing in my community and my union and working for collective action and collective empowerment, that the movement on the ground in the states isn't commensurate with the numbers that you just made mention of. And there's got to be a way that one builds the kind of core constituency to hold Washington, D.C. accountable.
I mean, this is a classic. You see this in all sorts of political issues in which there's diffuse public opinion on one side, even if it's large public opinion. 60% of people, someone brings them up, pollster says, are you worried about climate? Say, sure, right? And then there's concentrated but passionate resistance on the other side. And when you have that equation, and we see it in a whole bunch of issues, farm subsidies are the classic example of this, right? Like, you can get all the think tank reports you want, and you can talk about how, this farm subsidy doesn't make sense. But there's a small group of people that the farm subsidy makes a lot of sense to.
It's very concentrated, too, because if you look at it, the political angle, Ohio, it's the swing state, and you're looking for the actual votes. And then contextually pull out, we're still struggling economically. So it does regrettably fall to the back burner. When people rank it, it still may be an issue of concern, but ranking-wise, it's jobs and the economy. And finally, we're talking about is lobbying interests.
Right.
They have the power to go in there. So it was interesting to see the rah-rah of coal on both sides.
Yeah, I want to talk about coal specifically, because coal has really become a real centerpiece of the campaign. And I want to talk to someone who spent his life working in coal, a representative from the United Mine Workers, right after this.